Well, welcome everyone to SOC Presents Breaking Through Conversations on Equity and Inclusion Across Media. My name is Matt Seklecki, the event planning manager for SOC. This event is the second in a three-part series sponsored by the School of Communication. Please save the date for our final event on Wednesday, April 21st at 7 p.m. Eastern. And just a few reminders before we begin. We are recording the event so that others who couldn't make it can watch the conversation later. Closed captioning is available. Please keep your microphones muted until we get to the Q&A portion of the discussion. The first part of our event will be a moderated Q&A with our panelists, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. And then we will wrap things up with an opportunity to network with our panelists in breakout rooms. I'd like to thank our panelists for taking the time to be here with us tonight. And thank you to Isa Samusa, my student assistant, who has put in countless hours on this event series, and to the rest of the communication and outreach team at SOC for their support. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Danari Hairston. Danari joined the SOC Dean's Office in 2019 as the new assistant to the Dean and Inclusion Coordinator. In addition to that role, she has served as the co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for the past 2 years. Prior to working at AU, Danari was a fellow at Atlantic Media, where she managed a daily newsletter, wrote public policy analysis, and visualized data related to many topics, including immigration, private prisons, and environmental issues. She brings a variety of experiences honed in her internships at Atlantic Media, the Environmental Integrity Project, Grace Covenant Church, and the U.S. Department of Commerce. Danari has a keen interest in social justice issues and is passionate about inclusive excellence work. She is a graduate of Howard University with a bachelor's in English. And now I'll turn things over to Danari.
Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate the kind introduction. Like you said, I'm Danari. I'm the assistant to the Dean and Inclusion Coordinator, and a huge part of my role as an Inclusion Coordinator is just furthering our goals, either through events or other initiatives to create an inclusive environment, not only for students, but also for faculty and staff. So that's me, but I'm even more excited to introduce our awesome dynamic panelists for the evening who are going to be discussing issues of diversity and inclusion across the media, talking about underrepresentation, touching on some key career advice, and also hopefully equipping all of the students who are present with tools to break through barriers to equity in our careers in the past, present, and future. So without further ado, here are our panelists. First, we have Brandon Benavidez. Brandon is an esteemed alum of SOC. He earned his Master's of Arts in Journalism and Public Affairs at AU in 2004. Before attending AU, he earned his Bachelor's of Arts in Communication from St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. Now, Brandon is a content producer at NBC4 in Washington, D.C., and an adjunct lecturer at Georgetown University. He serves on the Mid-Atlantic Local Board for SAG-AFTRA, the Screen Actors Guild, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, for anyone who needs the acronym. From 2016 to 2018, he served as president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. An Emmy Award-winning journalist, he started his career as a producer at KETK TV in Tyler, Texas, and he's also worked at KSTP TV in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota, and KSAT 12 in San Antonio, Texas. Really rich history, and thank you so much for joining us, Brandon. Up next, I'd like to introduce to you all Alyssa Bradley. Alyssa Bradley, another proud alumna of SOC, graduated in May of 2020 with a BA in Public Relations and Strategic Communication. She currently works as an account coordinator at Fenton, where she uses her background in cultural communication, social media management, and politics to implement communication strategies that create lasting change. Alyssa supports the account and digital teams in many ways to execute strategies that move the needle on issues that she cares about the most. These range from environmental justice to global health equity. So welcome, Alyssa, and thank you so much for being here. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Kavell Brown. Kavell is the Senior Coordinator of Community Investment and Corporate Social Responsibility at ViacomCBS Incorporated. In his current role, Kavell oversees the company's corporate philanthropic giving, spearheads company-wide youth engagement initiatives, and helps to develop pro-social cause marketing campaigns with his team. So join me in welcoming our panelists. Excited to get into it with you all. And to just kick us off, I'd like to pose a question to kind of frame this conversation, and anyone who's willing can jump in to answer first. The question is, why is it important to promote representation in the media? And what does that look like in your career? Did you raise your hand, Alyssa?
I didn't, but I can go ahead and
That's okay, please.
So I think it's important to include representation in the media because it's so important for people to be able to see themselves in different spaces, in politics, in just different sectors. Important for people to like be able to say, oh, I can do this too. I think one of the big things that's happened in like the last decade, at least, with a lot of television shows putting more just communities of color at the head of shows has been so important because it's like, oh, I see myself in this life. Like I can be beautiful. I can be a politician. I can be president. I can do this, X, Y, Z. I think that's just really important. In my career, what was the second part of that question?
Yes, the second part was, in your career, what does it look like to promote representation in the media?
So for me, I work in public relations. So it's all about storytelling and trying to get people to do something basically. So I work in social cause communication, and a lot of my clients are trying to get people to basically care about these social causes, whether that's environmental justice, whether that's global public health, which includes like vaccine access, which is so important right now. I think it's very important to include representation in those things because it makes people just feel seen, like I said earlier. Like it just makes people want to reach out and want to do that. When I'm fighting for racial justice, for like everything that's happening in the country right now with Asian Americans, oh, that matters because it means that those communities matter. We're centering just different voices, and it shows that like they are important too.
Right. Of course. I'm actually really glad that you touched on the intersection of racial justice, social justice, and the media, because I really like to dig a little deeper into this question and talk about just this current national conversation around racism, particularly anti-Black and anti-Asian sentiments. How do you all think that the media perpetuates certain stereotypes and contributes to these sentiments? And what do you think is the media's role in creating the healing that we frankly need?
Well, since I work in TV, I think it's important that the newsroom reflects the community that it covers. So for us, we need to have a diverse newsroom, both in front of and behind the scenes, in front of the camera and behind the camera. So a diverse newsroom, with that being the producers, the editors, the people at the desk, managers, and then the on-air talent reporters and anchors. So I think it's important that that we reflect, the newsroom reflects the newsroom that we cover, and so they see that in front of the camera. And behind the scenes, the news managers, the people who make the decisions, decision makers, me as a producer, as a platform manager, as we decide what stories go on the air and how we cover the stories. So I think that's important. I also think it's important that newsrooms do tell the story of what's happening. So we were on the air and we were doing live coverage when the protests were happening on Black Lives Matter Plaza. We were on the air when then President Trump went through Lafayette Square. So we were bringing those pictures to you live as it happened. We were there live, and we were in network programming during the insurrection at the Capitol. But these are things that we do as journalists. We tell the story as it happens. And I was working overnight and producing the weekend morning show when those protests continued overnight and through the morning. So we were trying to convey what was happening on the ground and what was happening in the moment. So being in TV and on air specifically, bringing the viewers what's happening at the moment is very important. And we tell that story as best we can with what's happening.
Thank you so much, Brennan. I really appreciate that perspective on what it means to have diversity and inclusion in a newsroom and how that culminates into a diversity of perspectives being represented in the news. Kavell, I'd love to hear from you about what you think are some of the obstacles that underrepresented groups face in becoming part of the newsroom or becoming part of the industry that they want to be in to represent their identity.
Yeah, I think, well, coming from my perspective, being at, like a massive media conglomerate where, we have like CBS News and Showtime and Paramount Pictures and Nickelodeon and VidCon and all these different folks that exist. I think like some of the challenges is, just to be candid about it, like the Hollywood, which is what, entertainment is where I sit, like it's notoriously exclusionary, right? Like it's always like who are you connected to the producer? Are you connected to the showrunner? Like how can you get your pitch in front of somebody? How can you even do marketing? How can you even do finance, right? And I think, there's also that standpoint of like, there's like high demand but low supply. Like a lot of times, I used to work at HBO and I would ask people all the time, like, how many people do you think work at HBO globally? And people would say to me like 5,000, 10,000 people. And I tell them, no, it's only 2,500, right? And like, given the global footprint of what HBO is, most media companies are lean because of the revenue models that they have and how broadly they fit. Even at ViacomCBS, where I'm at now, globally we're only 30,000 people, which is like large, but like when you put that in the context of like mid to like large size companies, that's still on the smaller end, especially for the revenue that we gain. So I think those are that's like the overall background of what it means to like, it's inherently hard to get in the door because of like everybody wants to be close to like the entertainment or the content in and of itself. And then on top of that, I think there's like, the hard point of like, there can only be one, right? Like there needs to be like one Lisa Chang, or there needs to be like, one Gayle King or whatever have you, if you want to be in front of the camera or behind the camera. Like there's a seniority system, that exists with the guilds and like even if you think of like union jobs and non-union jobs. So I think that leads to it. I think another piece to it too is, the idea of having a code switch, having adopt to whiteness, if we're going to be candid about it, right? And having to like maneuver that space in that way where media entertainment is. So I think it's all around tough, but I think that, it is changing as time goes along, but it's still a long way to go. And I think, I'm hesitant to hand out roses, especially because, especially media entertainment has had such a role in perpetuating harm. I think there's a lot to do there, and I think it's important to hold things accountable but us celebrate the progress and the movement in and of itself.
Great, yeah, thank you for that answer. Did anyone else want to also add on to that? So I really appreciate, Kavell, how you touched on one of the barriers being that a lot of times jobs are acquired through relationships, and more often than not, people have relationships with people who look like them or come from the same socioeconomic background as them or went to the same university as them and things like that. And I think that what a lot of students would be really interested to know is, how did you all get to where you are? And I'd love to ask, starting with Alyssa, as a recent grad in 2020, how did you get into the role that you're in now? And what is some advice that you have for students on how to show up as your authentic self to the workplace?
Yeah, I'd love to touch on this. So I will say, just going back to the beginning, just even before I received this job, during my internships or anytime I was like volunteering at some place or going to a different organizational meeting, I always made it a point to find someone who looked like me and form a connection with them. Because as Kavell touched on, it's so important to have connections. And that's like the biggest obstacle to getting anything really, is to having a connection. I think that really puts you over the edge, and it helps you in whatever you're trying to pursue. With this current job though, I I feel like I can't really speak on like the connection part just because I didn't have connections at my current employer. I will say that I think that my internships really helped solidify this position currently, and I got those from connection. So that was more, like a little bit more helpful. And I did that just because whenever I would be at my internships, I would email people and say like, "Hey, let's sit down for coffee. Can I talk to you? Can I pick your brain about this career path? Can I talk to you about this?" And they would want to like help me. They would want to be a reference for me. They would want to write recommendation letters for me. And I think that's what pushed me to being able to get this position, especially in the middle of a pandemic. I had a lot of support, professionally and personally. And I think that's what was really important. That's like the advice that I would give any student that's interning right now or going to networking events or things. I would say obviously connect with a lot of different people, but I personally would connect to people that look like you. They want you to succeed as much as anyone else. So that's what my advice would be. That's what I would definitely solidify into my younger self. Like, keep doing what you're doing, because eventually it's going to get you into a good position. I was like one of the first of a lot of people like that I know, that graduated in 2020 to get a job, and I think that was a lot of the reason behind that.
Right.
So
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And thank you for sharing that. Brandon, I love to also hear your perspective on those two questions. How to navigate a career in a world where it is so relationship based, and also how to show up as your authentic self in the workplace.
I just want to reiterate about how important it is to have internships, because when you graduate and enter the working world, everybody has a degree. So I have my degrees on my wall, and you're competing with everybody that has already a bachelor's degree or master's degree. And so you want to set yourself apart, and you set yourself apart by doing internships. I interned at 2 stations in Austin, and I interned at 2 places here in Washington, D.C. when I was in graduate school. I interned in the House Radio TV Gallery, and I interned on Capitol Hill. And I also interned at NBC, Dateline NBC in the Washington Bureau. That's the same building where I work at now. So I made an impression when I worked as an intern in the Dateline Washington Bureau. And I would tell everybody, you want to do a good job at your internship, and you want to make it a good impression, because when it comes down to applying for jobs, you want your mentors, you want your supervisors, you want the people that you work with to remember you. And you want to be remembered for good things, not bad things. You want to be remembered for good things. And so you want to take full advantage of your internship. For example, when I interned at Dateline in 2004, it was the summer that Ronald Reagan had passed away. And the Dateline Bureau, we were crashing a special that we did a story on Ronald Reagan. And I was the one that was logging tapes. So I knew where all the videos were and where all the pictures were. So when it came down to edit, and I stayed editing until 1 or 2 in the morning. So I stayed through the evening and overnight to help the producers and the editor put together that piece that aired that weekend for Ronald Reagan. And so they remembered that I did that. They remembered that I stayed late and that I helped them. And I didn't know it at the time, but fast forward 5 years from 2004, In 2010, I had emailed the news directors in the Washington, D.C. area, and I emailed the assistant news director at WRC, Channel 4, where I work now, and I asked if I could meet for coffee. I would be in the area, and at the time I was working at KSTP in Minneapolis. And so I had emailed him, and I didn't know this at the time, but I found out several years later. He called upstairs. He called the producer, Jack Clordy. He called the people upstairs and asked, hey, do you remember Brandon Benavidez? And they did. They remembered that story. They remembered what I did as an intern. So he emailed me back and said that he would meet me for coffee. And I didn't know that at the time, but so you may not know that the people that you are working with will one day affect your career or one day talk good or bad about you. So you want to leave a good impression. Well, that coffee turned into a full interview. And so I interviewed for the job and I got the job 3 months later for a content producer. So that's how I got my job at WRC the first time around. The second time around, I still stayed in good contact with all of the managers at Channel 4. So they hired me back. Now that is, it's not uncommon, it's unusual, but I was hired back. And again, I maintained a good relationship with my former employers, and I also left a good impression. They wouldn't have hired me back if I didn't do a good job. So yes, it's people who you know, but you also want to stand out from others. And I'm an example of that. I made sure I made contact with different people, and I also make sure that I do an excellent job, because at the end of the day, it's about my name, about my credibility, and what I can bring to the table.
Wow, great answer. I think that you touched on so many key things that students in school will be fortunate to keep in mind, not only just building those relationships and the importance of networking, but making sure that same network remembers you as excellent, as timely, and as a hard worker. And we have just about 5 minutes left in this discussion portion of our event, but I'd love to get maybe just a quick round to add on to what Brandon said. What choices did you make in college, whether those be internships, organizations, etc., that were the most beneficial to your career now?
Yeah, I could start off. I think, I talk to college students all the time, and I think the most beneficial thing was me taking a leap. I have an IT degree, and I was originally interning at JP Morgan, doing IT work for them, but I kind of had this epiphany that I didn't want to do that, and I wanted to pivot over to like social impact work. And I've turned down my 4th internship with JP Morgan to say, hey, I'm going to find something else. And I think if I would have never took that leap of faith, I never would have materialized into like an internship at HBO and CSR, and then that turning into a full-time job at CSR, being there for 2 years, and then flipping over to ViacomCBS into the role I am now. And I think all that stood from having the conversation, being reflective enough to say, hey, like, what do I really want to do here? Like, what's really at my core, what's really at my heart? And I think, granted, like the choice of career and the choice of those things is a privilege in and of itself, because choice is a privilege. But I think it behooves all of us to, and I tell students this all the time, to have the conversation of, how do I care about money? What do I care about time? My proximity to my family. What's that one thing in my job that I'm really passionate about? Because monotony and processes are always going to exist inside my role. But what's that one piece that I really think should reverberate throughout any role that I get? And I think, once you have those values set down of like, okay, like money's not a motivator for me, but it's an influencer. Like, family is really important, or location is really important, or this, that, and the third. When you have those values set down, you know what you're going to say yes to and what you can say no to. And I think if I didn't have that set down in my standpoint, I would have been able to pivot out of tech into like social impact like I did. And I think that having that North Star and that compass really helps so much, and kind of removes the confusion of how to maneuver the workspace as best as you can.
Great. Yeah, I'm definitely hearing just identifying those core values that drive your professional choices, and also taking calculated risks, which is really good advice. And so I'd love to hear last from Alyssa on that one decision that you made in college that you would identify as beneficial for your career before we open it up to questions and talk to the students that have joined us.
Sure. So I think I actually have like two that I think really changed my life, I guess, and is what got me to where I am right now. I think one is taking those internships and diversifying them. So I knew that I wanted to be in communications. I love it. However, I never knew like what exactly I wanted to do. And I noticed like a lot of people will say freshman year, okay, I want to do this type of communication, and that's all I'm going to do for like the next 4 years. And then they get to it and they're like, wait, I'm like, this isn't what I want. So I made it a point to really diversify my resume and the internships that I did, go into all types of communication, corporate social responsibility, politics, corporate, just general corporate, to really figure out what I want to do. And I think I would tell other students to do that as well. Like, you have 4 years, not to spend it just interning, like have some fun, but also you have 4 years to really just explore what you want to do, and not be bogged down by like just starting a job and thinking that's it. Like, you have more time. But I would also say one of the biggest things that has gotten me to where I am is the organizations that I joined on campus. I feel like not everyone has the privilege to intern because sometimes those internships aren't paid. But organizations on campus are not far and few in between. They're like everywhere. And so I would suggest, if you have an interest, especially with SOC, if you have an interest in joining a club's executive board, you have like the power basically to transform their social media accounts, transform their external communication, their outreach. And it's just basically all on you. So when I was in my internship interviews, I would talk about my internships, like previous ones that I had, but I was really talking about like the work that I did for AU ambassadors on their Facebook page, or the work that I did writing newsletters for Alpha Kappa Alpha, my sorority. So like just various things like that, I feel like really shaped me, and I was able to talk more about like stuff that I was innovative in, that a lot of people can't really do. So I think those two things are really important.
Yeah. Alyssa, I think that's such a good point, because the topic of just the type of privilege that sometimes is required to even pursue an internship or have a fellowship over the summer, is a whole other conversation. So I'm really glad that you provided some other access points to people who might not feel that they have that opportunity to still acquire skills that are transferable in a job of their choice after graduation. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that. Well,
If I can add to that,
yes.
I would say it's important, if you want to be a journalist, to write. So I wrote for the school paper. I think that's important. So be involved in the school paper, yearbook, things like that. Those are important. So I would echo about being involved on campus activities, but you also want to hone your skills in as a journalist. So I wrote for the school paper for 2 years. And I also worked at the Gap, and I also interned. I don't know how I did it, but I did all of that. And then even in grad school, I still had a part-time job, and I worked, and I still had a part-time job. I went to grad school full-time, and then I also interned both summers. So I think time management is also important.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I have to say, I've known AU students to be juggling 2-3 jobs at a time. So definitely not the first time I've heard that. Well, thanks everybody for an amazing conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I think that there's a lot of great information that was shared. So I'd like to kind of open up the more informal networking session. I see